In 1968, one encounter would shake an entire countryside and all the towns around it. But what's worse is after this, many more would follow suit. And as incredibly bizarre as this story is, the things that take place after makes it all more disturbing. You won't want to miss this one. On July 2nd, 1968, a 14-year-old Argentinian boy named Oscar Iriart was going about his normal morning routine. Everything was just as it was. Now, you have to understand that Oscar, he was a very busy young man. And in addition to working a part-time job in town, he also had the responsibility of helping his father, Herberto, all around their family farm. And this farm was not small by any means. I mean, this was a whopping 178 acres, which meant, well, there were always chores to do. And so on this particular morning, Oscar's mother, Cesaria, had tasked him with checking one of the dividing fences that was on the property. Now, apparently, Oscar's father had left some old wiring material out there, and Cesaria wanted Oscar to go and fetch it. So Oscar, well, he'd set out on horseback to go and find this wiring. But there was a problem. You see, on this morning, the unusually dense fog had actually rolled in and settled over the countryside and Oscar's town and Sierra Chica. And so even though Oscar knew the property very well, he was having trouble finding the right spot in this thick, shrouded mist that kind of just hovered over everything. So Oscar rode around for a while searching for this dividing fence, and finally, at around 11:30 that morning, he spots some very familiar landmarks up ahead, and aha, he realized he was almost there, and so he's getting excited. But it was at that exact moment that Oscar's horse did something very unusual. Now, as Oscar and the horse rounded a bend in the trail, the horse just kind of stopped dead in its tracks. That was right next to a cluster of bushes. And so Oscar's confused by this, and he tries to get the horse moving again. And he's kind of poking it and prodding it aggressively, just trying to get it to close the distance between him and the fence. But for whatever reason, the horse refused to budge, and he couldn't figure out why. And then he realized he was not alone out there, because from deep within the fog, Oscar could barely make out a pair of shapes, and no one else was supposed to be out here, as far as he knew. So immediately, Oscar's mind just starts racing with possibilities of who or what this could be. Now, at first, he thought maybe they were workers or even travelers who had gotten lost in the fog, but the only thing that really made sense to Oscar in that moment was that he had stumbled upon a pair of hunters, maybe even poachers, who were actually taking advantage of the morning's low visibility to illegally hunt on the farm. Now, apparently, the farm had these abundant flocks of birds that made for easy targets. And so for a few more moments, Oscar thought that maybe he could just slip by these potential poachers undetected and either reach his destination or head back to the house. But that hope was quickly dashed when Oscar realized that he had been spotted, and now the two shapes that were in the fog were actually now waving out to him, and it seemed like they were beckoning Oscar to come closer. And so immediately, this wave of anxiety kind of just crashed over him, because Oscar knew that if these were poachers, this was not a great situation to be in at all. And why would poachers want him to come closer? Unless they wanted to hide their crimes by leaving no loose ends. And so now Oscar swallows nervously at that thought, but he remembered something that his father had always told him, that he had to grow up at some point and he had to learn to be brave, even in harrowing situations like this. And so Oscar figured that maybe this was the opportunity to do that, and to run these poachers off and to show how valuable he could be around the farm. He was going to do it. So gathering all of his courage, Oscar slid down from his horse and he took several steps towards the intruders. And each second was just painful and agonizing, because he's just thinking, the worst is going to happen. I'm going to get killed. And Oscar finally got close enough to start to make out what these two men looked like. Now, at first, he thought, yep, he was right. These are poachers. I mean, after all, to him, they looked to be around his height, which was 5'7", and their facial features didn't really look that different from someone you might run into on the streets of Sierra Chica. But as Oscar began to draw closer, he began to notice some details that seemed very out of place. I mean, first of all, both figures were male and they were identical. Like, what are the odds of running into identical twin poachers? But the first thing that really alarmed Oscar was their hair. It was this bright white and kind of clung to the tops of their heads in these short, sparse amounts, kind of as if they were almost bald. And below that would sit a pair of these sunken-in eyes that Oscar, for whatever reason, could not tear his gaze away from. As I said, they were sunken and kind of just unblinking, never taking their focus off Oscar either as he would walk towards them through the fog. And so when Oscar would get to about 10 feet away, this voice would suddenly break the silence, and it was them speaking to him, and they said something that was so weird and bizarre that it actually is terrifying. And they said this to him: "You are going to know the world." And as they said this, I was kind of thinking the C-3PO voice, that "you're going to know the world." Now, Oscar wasn't really sure which of the men spoke it, but it was in perfect Spanish. Obviously not English, because this is Argentina. Now, Oscar would later describe this voice as a thick, medium, strong. And so after licking his lips and clearing his throat, he would finally manage to respond to them that yes, of course, that someday after he saved up money, he will indeed travel. And so after that, this kind of awkward moment of silence was exchanged between the two, and Oscar just found this whole exchange very strange. And he would have expected a friendlier greeting and maybe even an exchange of names, so what exactly was going on here? But now that Oscar was closer, he was able to make out even more stranger details about these people. And he was still transfixed by their unwavering, unblinking gaze, but somehow he would find the willpower to break the eye contact and examine the rest of their very bizarre appearance. And as Oscar would glance down below the two men's necks and actually kind of see the uniforms they were dressed in, he would realize there's something more than meets the eye here. Both of these men wore identical outfits. They were light-colored gloves in their hands, red t-shirts covering their chest, but below that, things got even stranger. I mean, we're talking like X-Files strange. So Oscar's blinking, just trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and at first he thought that, it had to have been the fog obscuring his vision, but he's looking and he could see that their pants or their legs, whatever, they were not hidden in the fog. They were almost translucent or invisible. In fact, Oscar could clearly make out the fence and blades of grass behind the outlines of their pants and what appeared to be equally transparent black shoes. Now, something began to click inside his head in that moment. He knew this whole scenario was very wrong. Gee, Oscar, you don't think? I mean, from his horse refusing to move, and you know how they say animals can pick up on bizarre things and how they just sense things ahead of time? Well, that should have been enough for Oscar, but apparently it wasn't. Now, in addition to all of that, the strange behavior and appearance of these men, and he realized he wasn't dealing with anything normal here. Now, as he began to think this sudden urge kind of just filled Oscar that he needed to run, and now. And so he turned around to try to flee, but found himself actually physically rooted to the spot. His limbs would not respond, and it was like he was paralyzed in place. He couldn't move. And so here he was, just standing in front of these two bizarre, semi-transparent strangers, even though he wanted nothing more than to just get away as fast as he could. Now, interestingly, the beings didn't even seem to notice Oscar's alarm. And instead, one of them picked up the conversation right where Oscar had left off, about seeing the world when he was older. And so the beings would tell him that no, and they began shouting at him that they will take him now. And almost what seemed like a brief comedic pause, the being added to Oscar that they can't take him because they have too much cargo, but will have to come back for him. Now, obviously, Oscar's very confused. He's taken aback by this declaration. Cargo? What in the world was this strange visitor talking about? What is going on? These two beings kind of just gestured in the direction of the road, and there you would see, perched widely right near a wide, muddy ditch between the fence and the road, sat this enormous oval-shaped object that was resting on three legs. Now, Oscar would later describe this as having some kind of hinged lid on top, though he couldn't see anything inside from where he was currently standing. Now, the beings had said that they came loaded with cargo, which explained why they couldn't take Oscar with them right then. But little did Oscar know, what happened next would move his strange encounter from a simple, I guess you can call this UFO sighting, into the realm of what many researchers called high strangeness. You know, those absurd, almost dreamlike experiences that seem to operate on a logic very different from our everyday reality. Yeah, this is one of those. And so as Oscar stood there processing what he was seeing, one of the beings approached him, and it held a white paper envelope, but outlined in this kind of violet coloring with some kind of document sealed inside. Now, the being would hand the envelope to Oscar, and then the two visitors would point at a nearby puddle of water, and somehow Oscar knew what they wanted him to do. It was like they were telling him telepathically. They wanted him to demonstrate something with the envelope and the puddle of water. So Oscar just headed over to the puddle with both beings silently walking behind him. And when he reached the edge, he kneels down, still holding the envelope, and he would then do something that's very strange. They made him take the envelope and pass it through the water of the puddle. But oddly enough, the paper didn't get wet. And this seemed completely miraculous to Oscar as he's watching this. It was as if the landed craft and semi-transparent beings weren't enough, and the fact that this envelope stayed completely dry after being submerged just confirmed to him that, okay, he was truly interacting with an intelligence from another world. Now, the beings then noticed how impressed Oscar was with their demonstration, and once he was done running the envelope through the water, they turned around without another word and kind of just glided or climbed into their craft and began to silently ascend up through the dense fog, going higher and higher until completely vanishing. Now, Oscar didn't wait for the object to disappear completely. No. He didn't even look up. Instead, he found himself running back on his horse, fleeing the entire time like he was asleep or on autopilot, and so he mounts the horse, which stayed stubbornly in place until the craft was completely out of sight, and then Oscar would race across the field towards home, riding faster than he ever had in his life. Now, along the way, neighbors would actually make note of how Oscar seemed to be fleeing from danger. And within 5 minutes' time, Oscar burst through his front door, startling his mother. And the moment he came in, his mom knew that something had to have happened. And the first thing she noticed was just how hysterical and shaken up he seemed. He was speaking rapidly and barely pausing to breathe, and he's kind of hyperventilating, and she could really only make out snippets of what he was saying, something about strange people on their property and messages and promises or threats to take him with them. Now, it wasn't until Oscar's father, Roberto, and his two siblings arrived that his mother noticed her son's eyes. They looked different somehow, glossy and far away, like his mind was somewhere else, but his mother detected something else beneath the surface of his trance-like state and would later describe it as if he had just really kind of come out of this hypnotic state or was afraid of this strange vision. Now, that was when Oscar actually handed over the physical evidence of this supposed otherworldly encounter, the actual envelope the beings had given him. And only then did his mother start to believe her son's bizarre, out there story. And so at this point, Oscar repeated his account again so that his parents could hear every single detail about these bizarre visitors. Now, of course, at first, he was met with the same reaction that so many people of high strangeness face: disbelief. This story was just so weird, and the details were so absurd and nonsensical to ever truly be taken seriously. And yet, Oscar had the proof right there in his hands, this strange, mysterious document. Now, Herberto and his mother crowded around as Oscar carefully unfolded the ordinary-looking piece of notebook paper, and there, scribbled inside in crude handwriting, was a message that read, "You will know the world." Signed, Flying Saucer. To add to the absurdity, the way it's signed as Flying Saucer in Spanish technically reads P volador, which translates to S flying. The adjective comes after the noun in Spanish, so Plato volador literally means saucer flying. Though it's well documented, Oscar's bizarre encounter is rarely discussed by modern ufologists, and that's probably because the silly details kind of just make the whole thing sound like a sketch from a comedy show. I mean, after all, from the beings retracting their offer to take him due to having too much cargo, and to the waterproof envelope, the ridiculous note they left behind, it all just kind of comes off as more humorous than terrifying. But at the time, in the late 1960s, when flying saucers were all the rage worldwide, Argentinian UFO researchers took Oscar's case very seriously, and they were especially intrigued by the additional physical evidence that was left behind at the scene, which would leave investigators and law enforcement kind of just baffled and scratching their heads because they really had no idea how to explain it. Now, it's important to note here that the emotional impact that this event had on Oscar and his family was beyond anything they could imagine. I mean, here you had this strange letter that nobody could explain, and you had Oscar sticking to his guns about the story, and his father and his mother had also other reasons to believe that their son had experienced something very unusual. And they were very concerned about his agitated and mental state and kind of how his eyes looked dazed and just kind of far out. And even Oscar himself seemed very shaken by whatever had happened to him out in that foggy field that day. Even his own mother would go on to explain that when he came home, she realized that he was very scared and that he seemed transformed and he was startled. And that's the state he was in for a few days after his experience. And for the following year, he refused to go out to that particular part of the property. And so you have that part of it, but then his mother was also afraid about the other portion of this experience because now she's thinking, even if what he has to say isn't exactly true in terms of what he saw, she's afraid of people coming back to take her son because maybe they're not aliens, maybe they're people who want to hurt him. That he is actually being threatened, that whoever these people are going to come back and come looking for him. What if it's the cartel? Oh my gosh, I mean, my son is in danger no matter which way you splice this pie. This obviously brought the attention of a lot of news reporters coming in from and around the area because, I mean, something this crazy would bring a lot of attention. And this was actually right after he had mentioned it to a few people in town, his father, and as you can imagine, that kind of thing would spread like wildfire, and it did, and pretty soon everybody in the region was talking about this flying saucer that allegedly landed near the Sierra Chica. Now, interestingly, among the most interested who had heard about the story was a journalist who would quickly flock to this farm and actually go to interview young Oscar. There was a reporter from the El Popular newspaper by the name of Amarante who actually spent a lot of time with Oscar, kind of just questioning him about all the specifics about his very in-depth experience. And after speaking with him for a very extensive amount of time, this reporter concluded that Oscar's hypnotic state had likely been caused by these beings who relayed telepathic messages to his brain, and that's seriously how he explained it in print. And as you can imagine, that his dramatic write-up in the El Popular newspaper would capture the public's imagination and would just kind of set off a full-blown media frenzy all around the Irariart family. In fact, his mother would go on to describe the complete overwhelming toll that this newfound publicity took on their family. And she would explain that her son just stopped going out in public, stopped leaving the farm because people would harass him, they would chase him down, they would attack him, they would beg him for comments, just complete and total disrespect. Not to mention the people that would harass him and verbally attack him, telling Oscar that he's a liar and that they're skeptical of what really happened and that he's only doing it and faking it for attention. You know the drill. And in fact, Oscar's story got a lot of negative attention, just naturally being what it was, and pretty soon a lot of people just assumed that he had just created this whole elaborate hoax to try and get attention for some reason. They even argued and scoffed at the mysterious letter that was written for Oscar as something he had just wrote himself and not by these strange alien visitors. And they would even point to the terrible handwriting and grammar and spelling errors as proof of this. However, even through all the backlash and just bad talking, Oscar would continue to insist that the note that was given to him was indeed authentic. Now, interestingly, Oscar would later provide the police with handwriting samples to prove that it wasn't him, and so when they would compare it against his samples, it didn't match. Now, as for the actual letter, Oscar would go on to recount that he would later be forced to give it over to police, and of course, after hearing his story, they too would put it in water, and it would get wet, and he doesn't know exactly what happened with it there. They just took it, they confiscated it, he never saw it again, never got it back. Now, aside from the questionable document, the most seemingly compelling evidence was, of course, the alleged landing site right near the road where Oscar said he saw the UFO parked. And the first official person to lay eyes on it was a police sergeant by Raul Coronel. Now, Raul was this very no-nonsense man, and he wasn't the type to indulge in tall tales, let alone ones involving flying saucers. He had no patience for wasting police resources investigating an outlandish story or hoax made up by some 14-year-old kid. But nevertheless, this sergeant took his job very seriously and dutifully arrived at the farm within 12 hours of Oscar reporting his experience. And so around midnight, he actually headed out to the spot by the road, accompanied by several other locals, including Carlo and Jose Luis Marinangal, a mechanic by the name of Hugo Rodriguez, and Walter Vaccaro. And so when they all reached the location that Oscar had described and they shone their flashlights on the ground, Raul was shocked by what he saw. And so he turned to the others and told them to look. Even though he did not believe such stories, there were strange markings on the tracks where the boy had said that he saw the craft. As it turns out, maybe Oscar was telling the truth. And so everybody's kind of shocked by what they're seeing, and they all agree that there was definitely something unusual going on. I mean, there were impressions in the soil that couldn't have been easily made by anything else. And so as everybody's standing around looking at these odd impressions in the ground, Carlos looks up in the sky, because he's with them as they're doing this, and he yells to the group that there's more strange lights coming. And so everybody responds. They're all looking up at where Carlos is pointing, and sure enough, there it was, this blinding, zigzagging light that was slowly moving in their direction and was only hovering about a few hundred feet above the ground. And as it began to approach them, they wondered if they were truly about to be invaded by aliens. And as you can imagine, they were taken aback, they were shocked, they were surprised, they were probably terrified. And this light kind of just passed close overhead before it kind of just continued to meander over the fields nearby. And then it would abruptly change course and zoom off in a tremendous speed and vanish in the night sky. And so after it vanished, the men kind of just stood there stunned in silence, not really sure what to even make of what they just saw or experienced. Now, eventually, they all calmed down enough to return and give an official report. Now, they can only say one thing to their superiors over and over, and that was that flying saucers do exist. And interestingly, out of everybody there that night, nobody had a bigger change of heart than Sergeant Coronel. And he would actually, in this experience, go from a true skeptic to a true believer, swearing up and down that what he witnessed wasn't just something the military made or that humans made, it had to have been extraterrestrial in nature. But his bosses, of course, were less than thrilled with this, and Raul would soon find himself transferring to the town of Azul as a result of filing that report, probably as a punishment because they now saw him as crazy. But before Sergeant Coronel was reassigned, he did make sure to show everybody the most compelling piece of physical evidence left behind at the scene. And that, my friends, was a series of these 3 very strangely precise indentations in the ground that formed a perfect geometric shape. Now, these markings were extensively documented by the El Popular journalist Amarante, who also happened to be an amateur archaeologist. And even he was very impressed by the surgical precision of these holes, because he claimed that they could have only been made by an expert with very specialized tools and, well, a lot of time on their hands that most didn't have. Now, Amarante would measure the indentations that he assumed were left by the UFO's landing gear, and would go on to discover that they were roughly 12 centimeters deep. Even more crazy to him was the distance between the marks. Now, using thread and stakes, Amarante would then determine that the 3 holes formed a perfect isosceles triangle that only an expert with time and elements is in position to make. He would go on to describe that the base of the triangle measured roughly 6.5 feet, while each of the 2 equal sides were 5 feet 2 inches long. Now, you need to understand that highly specific measurements like this don't exactly happen by accident. To Amarante and many others, this was a clear sign that something very strange had touched down in that field, and it wasn't the product of some teenage prank. Now, despite this compelling evidence, skeptics over the years have really pushed back on that idea that a precise triangular formation can only ever be produced by alien technology or, uniquely skilled experts, as Amarante claimed. And in fact, they went on to argue that given Oscar's age and his educational background at the time, because he was only a first-year high school student, he likely had the basic knowledge of some geometry, at least enough needed to dig 3 holes in the shapes of a triangle. As a matter of fact, part of the standard curriculum for kids his age in Argentina in 1968 included learning how to construct that exact type of triangle. And the whole 12-centimeter depth doesn't seem outside the realm of a possibility for a motivated 14-year-old to ever achieve. Now, perhaps the most damning evidence against Oscar's story is the fact that while the area around this landing site was muddy, the only footprints found anywhere near the indentations belonged to Oscar himself. These strange, otherworldly visitors that he apparently came into contact with, well, there was no impressions left of them. Now, for Oscar, though, the lack of any other footprints aside from his own wasn't an inconsistency in his story. In fact, it was further proof of the unnatural advanced abilities that these beings possessed. He believed they could appear and disappear at will. And regardless of the divided opinions of the physical evidence and all the other circumstances surrounding this strange case, one big question hangs over everything. And that is, what kind of person is Oscar Iriart? Was he the type of person to fabricate such an elaborate tale, or did he have this reputation as a trickster or even an attention seeker? Now, interestingly, by all accounts, he was the last kid that anybody would have expected to cook up a hoax like this. Now, as he was known by his family, his friends, his town, he was a very serious, level-headed boy, much like his father, whose interests didn't include anything regarding science, fiction, or at the very least, aliens. In fact, at the time, he was too busy working part-time as a bookkeeper and tinkering with mechanical projects to ever spend time orchestrating such a grand, crazy, strange UFO sighting. Now, we have to understand that obviously Oscar's parents are probably biased, but even they describe their son as not being the imaginative type, especially compared to city children. And in fact, his mom basically went on to tell in a report that her son is just a simple country boy, and that he's not like the boys from the city who are more alive, more intelligent, more creative, that he should have no concept of aliens or UFOs. And Oscar would later confirm in a report that, well, his mom's characterization of him was correct, and that he's a no-nonsense kind of man. He's not the kind to lie or make up tall tales. And he would go on about how he doesn't like to read and doesn't like papers, and he just likes doing manual country labor. Now, despite all the craziness of the story and even how so many people wrote him off as, someone who's fabricating a tall tale in order to seek fame and fortune or just attention, what's interesting is that many UFO investigators who've interacted with him or looked at the case all came away with one impression: that Oscar was being very sincere and very genuine in how he was shaken up by the experience and how he had no idea how to explain any of it away, and that he didn't seem like a natural liar or someone who was about to pull a fast one on the entire community around him. Fast forward to July in that same year, the entire region became overwhelmed by this massive wave of UFO sightings. Actually, from about May 29th to June 27th, in came this just flood of reports into the police about strange lights being sighted over the sky, strange crafts over the mountains and towns. And in fact, there's one in particular that stands out because of just how dramatic it is. Many farmers located near Kalama insisted that they had all witnessed these several strange saucer-like crafts landing down, and that when the vehicles touched down on the ground, several strange occupants emerged out and would then go to peer into the windows of all the terrified onlookers before they would lose interest and return back to their ship and fly away. Now, around this same time, a 25-year-old copper miner named Romulo Velasquez claimed that a UFO had actually landed near him in Bolivia, and he would describe seeing these tall, thin beings exit the craft and then would approach him, giving him the impression that they wanted something from him, even though they never spoke a word. Now, Romulo was clearly terrified by this and would actually faint before he could ever figure out what this being was trying to get from him. And when he came to, the strange alien visitor and the craft had vanished. So while Oscar's account is very interesting, I think what's more interesting is how his experience fits into the larger context of other UFO sightings in Argentina and all the neighboring countries, especially in the late 1960s. What I also find interesting is the overall plausibility to Oscar's story. I mean, if he were really trying to deceive people, wouldn't he have invented a more, straightforward, less goofy alien encounter? I mean, one with, say, telepathic communication rather than random broken Spanish and an introduction letter from the UFO itself. Or if the entire thing was just some big hoax and he really was trying to pull a fast one, maybe he just had a vividly wild imagination and a sense of humor we'll probably never understand. But one thing that was strange is that he didn't like the attention that this case brought him. As far as the strange experience that Oscar had, including these bizarre beings and the note they gave him and just everything that would happen afterwards, unfortunately, it remains a mystery. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment down below, "You're going to know the world." Because I always think of that like the C-3PO voice, like I told you guys. So anyways, that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys want more cinematic storytelling like this, where we really kind of just dive into the meat and potatoes of things, then go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for more episodes like this, and I'll catch you all in the very next episode. Just kidding.